What gets measured gets managed. But what if this creates diversity that destroys inclusion? I'm Dr. Jonathan. I work with organizations to make them inclusive, and I'm on a mission to help 1 million people like you to make your workplace inclusive. Get your pen and paper ready because we're talking about when corporate diversity targets destroy inclusion. This can happen in a corporate environment. Corporations often create outcomes that aren't very inclusive. As a regular listener, you're probably thinking you already know why. And that's the 3 biggest problems that organizations experience on their inclusion journey. People, potential, performance. People. Organizations have trouble engaging the people they want to include. Potential. Organizations struggle to create a culture of inclusion where everyone can reach their potential. And then there's performance. Organizations find it difficult to articulate a business case for diversity for their specific organization. People, potential, performance, we talk about this all the time. And it makes sense. A lot of the research we discuss is informed by corporations. A lot of the narratives around diversity and inclusion in general is informed by corporations. A lot of our clients are corporations. And the truth is, corporations are responsible for creating a lot of the value that society enjoys. I'm confident that you're listening to this podcast on a device that was created by a corporation. But corporations also produce and reproduce a lot of the inequality that we find in society. We discuss this all the time, but many organizations, many corporations are trying to address it. And one way you may have encountered are quotas and targets. A problem with this approach, particularly in corporate environments, is that the measure often becomes the goal, and this leads to unintended outcomes. You may have heard people say, what gets measured gets managed. But a consequence of managing these measurements is that the thing that gets measured becomes the goal instead of what it's supposed to represent. I'll explain what I mean. It's what economists call perverse incentives. Economists are always talking about incentives, and a great example of this is the Cobra Effect. It's an anecdote attributed to German economist Horst Siebert, and I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. I don't know if the story is true, but it makes an important point. According to the story, in India, during British rule, the British government were concerned about the number of deadly cobras in Delhi. So they offered a bounty in return for every dead cobra, thinking that this was an incentive for people to kill the unwanted cobras. People would get paid for every dead cobra provided, and this would reduce the overall cobra population. According to the story, that's what happened at first. People turned up with dead cobras, they collected the bounty, and this indeed reduced the overall cobra population. Then, people turned the measure into the goal. So the measure, dead cobras, became the goal. So what did people do? They had a clear goal, dead cobras. According to the story, people began to breed cobras, which they subsequently killed and then used to collect the bounty. This is incentivized behavior given the measure. According to the story, this practice got out, and once the British government found out, they scrapped the bounty. But guess what happened next? According to the story, what happened next was the cobra breeders set the cobras free. Why? Well, they no longer had an incentive to breed the cobras, and they no longer had an incentive to kill the cobras. According to the story, the unintended outcome of this was the cobra population increased to a number that was greater than the original problem. Some of you are thinking, cool story, but what's this got to do with inclusion? Well, a lot of organizations are setting targets. In the UK, we call them targets because it's actually illegal to have quotas in the way that other countries do. But some organizations are setting targets for so-called marginalized groups. Some organizations are hitting their targets for so-called marginalized groups. These targets are the measures. But here's the thing. What a lot of organizations don't like to admit is that they're having difficulty retaining people from so-called marginalized groups. What a lot of organizations don't like to admit is that they haven't articulated their true goal. And even if they have, it may not be properly incentivized. If you accept that what gets measured gets managed, this helps to explain how the measure has become the goal. In case you're unclear here, we believe that a useful goal is to create an inclusive workplace where everyone can perform, everyone can belong, everyone can reach their potential. That's the goal. That's why we're called the element of inclusion, not the element of diversity. That's why we talk about diversity and inclusion. Equity, equality, justice, belonging. We don't ignore these things. It's baked into everything we do here. Every week we talk about models, frameworks, techniques, and approaches, but we don't mistake the measure for the goal. I don't want you to mistake the measure for the goal. Some organizations are fixated on the target, and they can work as long as it's a measure and not a goal. If you've got X% of people from a particular social identity group, does that make you inclusive? Well, there's not enough information to say, but if not, then words like token, tick box, and performative get used. What if people learn that you're trying to increase the numbers but not improve the workplace? What if people learn that you're focused on the short term but not the long term? What if people learn that you're copying and pasting what others are doing without thinking about your own circumstances? This may lead to unintended consequences if the market learns that you're focused on measures and not goals. I don't want this to happen to you, and it doesn't have to be a part of your future. So let's wrap this up. What are the key messages here? 1. Corporations use measures to guide behavior. 2. Corporations often mistake the measures for the goal. And 3. Focus on goals and use measures where appropriate. So what do you think? What measures are you focused on? Get in touch or leave a message. I would love to hear from you. If you've learned something from today's show, then give us a review on iTunes. It helps other people like you to find the show. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode.